A millionaire saw a child pointing at a trash can, crying without stopping. When he came closer, the millionaire could not believe what he had found. The heavy iron door of Warren's restaurant creaked open at midnight, casting long shadows across the empty dining room. Ruby's heart pounded against her chest as she crouched behind the wine cabinet, clutching the small recorder in her trembling hands. The voices grew louder. Warren and his chef discussing something in hushed, urgent tones. Julian's brother is getting too close. Warren's voice carried across the room, dripping with contempt. We need to make sure he never finds out what really happened. Ruby pressed herself further into the shadows, barely daring to breathe. The recorder felt like it was burning in her palm, their confessions captured forever on the tiny device. Through the gap between the cabinets, she could see Warren's expensive shoes pacing back and forth, his agitation evident in every step. The chef's voice was hesitant, uncertain. "But sir, if he has evidence." Evidence. Warren's laugh was cold, hollow. The only evidence died with Julian years ago. Unless he stopped suddenly, his shoes turning toward the wine cabinet. Unless someone's been helping him. Ruby's blood ran cold. She knew she should run, but Derek was counting on her. After everything he'd done to help her off the streets, she couldn't fail him now. The memory of finding the abandoned baby with Julian's watch flashed through her mind the moment that had started it all. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the darkness. Warren Derek's voice echoed through the restaurant. Ruby's heart leaped. He wasn't supposed to be here yet. "What did you do to my brother?" The sound of rapid footsteps followed, then a sickening thud. Ruby peered through the gap just in time to see Derek crumple to the floor, the chef standing over him with a heavy skillet. Blood trickled from Derek's temple, forming a dark pool on the polished floor. Well, Warren's voice was almost gleeful. "It seems we have two problems to solve tonight." Ruby bit back a scream, tears streaming down her face. The recorder captured everything: the violence, the cruel laughter, the sound of Derek's body being dragged across the floor. She knew at that moment that she held not just evidence, but the key to justice for Julian, for Derek, and for herself. Now she just had to find a way out alive. If this opening scene stirred something in your heart, join us on this journey of justice and redemption. Every subscription empowers us to craft more powerful stories that illuminate the triumph of love over darkness. Your support makes these tales of hope possible. Derek Thompson stood at his brother's grave, the morning mist clinging to the marble headstone. 10 years had passed since Julian's death, but the weight of loss still pressed heavily on his shoulders. The official report claimed it was natural causes, a sudden illness that took Julian at just 32. But Derek knew better. He had seen the changes in his brother during those final months, watched as Julian's vibrant spirit slowly dimmed. Julian had been more than just Derek's younger brother. He was the dreamer of the family. While Derek pursued a career in finance, Julian poured his heart into his culinary ambitions. His dream wasn't just to open a restaurant, it was to create a sanctuary where everyone, regardless of their status, could find warmth and acceptance through food. Food brings people together, Julian would say, his eyes sparkling with passion. It doesn't discriminate between rich and poor. The last time Derek saw Julian alive, something was different. His brother's hands trembled as he clutched his prized possession, a simple toy watch their father had given him before passing. "Keep it safe," Julian had whispered, pressing the watch into Derek's hands. Sometimes the simplest things hold the biggest secrets. The next day, Julian was found dead in his apartment. Derek's investigation into his brother's death hit wall after wall. The police dismissed his concerns, treating him like a grieving brother unable to accept reality. But the coincidences were too stark to ignore. Julian's death came just weeks after he'd secured funding for his restaurant in the same neighborhood where Warren's upscale establishment now stood. Their mother never recovered from the loss. She spent her final years defending Julian's reputation against whispered accusations of theft and fraud rumors that seemed to originate from Warren's circle. The sight of her withering away under the weight of those lies haunted Derek. She died believing her youngest son's name would forever be tarnished. Derek's marriage crumbled under the strain of his obsession with Julian's case. His wife couldn't understand why he couldn't just let it go, but how could he let go when everything about Julian's death felt wrong? The mysterious illness, the missing documents, the way Warren's restaurant rose from the ashes of Julian's dreams, it all pointed to something sinister. For years, Derek gathered fragments of evidence, keeping everything in a worn leather briefcase. Newspaper clippings, Julian's old recipes, photographs of him with the community he hoped to serve, pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The toy watch remained locked in his safe, its significance a mystery he had yet to unravel. Each year, on Julian's birthday, Derek would sit at the grave, sharing a meal he'd prepared using one of his brother's recipes. "I'll find the truth," he'd promise, watching the candle flicker in the growing darkness. "I'll clear your name, little brother, whatever it takes." The breakthrough came in the most unexpected way through a homeless child named Ruby and an abandoned baby with a familiar watch. It was as if Julian was reaching out from beyond, finally ready to reveal the truth that had been buried for so long. Now, standing at the grave once more, Derek felt a renewed sense of purpose. The morning mist began to lift, and with it, the shadows that had clouded his brother's memory. "I'm close, Julian," he whispered, touching the cold stone. "This time, justice won't be denied." Ruby Mitchell learned early that survival meant becoming invisible. At 12, the streets of Boston had taught her more about life than any classroom ever could. During the day, she melted into crowds, just another shadow people hurried past. At night, she sought refuge in the back alley of Warren's prestigious restaurant, where the warmth from the kitchen vents provided some comfort against the biting cold. Her earliest memories were fragments of a different life, a woman's gentle voice singing lullabies, the smell of fresh baked bread, and a tiny apartment filled with cookbooks. But those memories grew hazier with each passing year. Now her reality was the constant gnaw of hunger and the struggle to remain unseen. Warren's restaurant became both her salvation and her torment. Sometimes, in moments of desperate hunger, she would slip through the back door, scavenging leftover food from the kitchen. The staff, if they noticed her, treated her like a stray cat, occasionally leaving scraps but never acknowledging her humanity. Only the head chef showed any kindness, secretly leaving untouched plates of food behind the dumpster. One night changed everything. Ruby overheard Warren speaking to a well-dressed woman about a former employee named Julian. "Poor fool thought he could compete with me," Warren had laughed. "Some people don't understand their place in the world." Something in his tone made Ruby's skin crawl. She began paying closer attention to the conversations that drifted through the kitchen vents. The restaurant's walls held secrets. Late at night, Ruby would hear Warren's angry outbursts, witness suspicious meetings in the back alley, and observe as certain documents disappeared into the restaurant's ancient furnace. She kept a small notebook, recording dates and snippets of conversations, though she barely understood their significance. Despite her circumstances, Ruby maintained a fierce dignity. She used the public library to educate herself, spending hours reading cookbooks and dreaming of a different life. Sometimes she'd stand outside the restaurant's front windows, watching families enjoy their meals together, imagining herself on the other side of the glass. Warren caught her once, rifling through the kitchen's garbage. Instead of calling the police, he offered her a deal: she could clean the restaurant after hours in exchange for leftover food. The offer seemed like mercy, but Ruby soon realized it was control. Warren watched her constantly, asking questions about what she'd seen or heard. Each meal felt like a transaction, bought with her silence. The other homeless children warned her about Warren. "He's not kind," they'd say. "He uses people, but hunger made choices simple." Ruby learned to move silently, to keep her eyes down, to become the invisible presence Warren wanted. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow connected to this place, to the mysterious Julian whose name she'd heard whispered in dark corners. She found old photographs in the restaurant's storage room, pictures of a different establishment that once stood there. In them, a young man with kind eyes stood proudly in a chef's uniform, surrounded by community members. The photos showed a different vision for the space, one of warmth and inclusion rather than exclusivity. Something about the man's smile tugged at Ruby's memories, but she couldn't understand why. Everything changed the night she found the baby in the dumpster, wrapped in old newspapers with a toy watch around its tiny wrist. The discovery set in motion a chain of events that would finally connect all the pieces: her mysterious past, Warren's secrets, and the truth about Julian's death. When Derek Thompson entered her life, asking questions about his brother Julian, Ruby recognized a chance for both justice and redemption. For the first time, she had a purpose beyond mere survival. The notebook she'd kept, filled with overheard conversations and observed secrets, might hold the key to uncovering the truth. Warren Pierce's empire was built on a foundation of broken dreams and carefully crafted lies. From the polished mahogany tables to the crystal chandeliers, every inch of his restaurant testified to his ruthless pursuit of success. Yet few knew the true cost of his rise to power, or the lives he'd destroyed along the way. 20 years ago, Warren was just another struggling restaurateur in Boston's competitive dining scene. His establishment, then called Pierce's Place, barely stayed afloat, serving mediocre food to dwindling crowds. The arrival of Julian Thompson in the neighborhood should have been insignificant, just another young chef with big dreams. But Julian's vision of an inclusive community restaurant threatened everything Warren had built. Warren watched with growing resentment as Julian's concept gained support. While he struggled to maintain his exclusive clientele, Julian's pop-up community dinners drew crowds from all walks of life. Local businesses pledged support, charmed by Julian's genuine desire to create a space where everyone belonged. The final straw came when Warren's own investors began questioning his business model, comparing it unfavorably to Julian's innovative approach. The transformation began subtly. Warren hired private investigators to dig into Julian's past, looking for weaknesses. He manipulated health inspectors, bribed local officials, and spread rumors about Julian's character. But Julian's reputation remained untarnished, protected by the genuine love he'd earned from the community. Warren's masterstroke came in the form of a partnership offer. He approached Julian with promises of collaboration, painting a picture of a restaurant that could serve both their visions. Julian, ever trusting, shared his business plans, his recipes, his dreams. Warren used this information to systematically dismantle everything Julian had built. The poisoning started gradually, small doses in Julian's daily coffee, delivered with a friendly smile. Warren watched with calculated satisfaction as Julian's health declined, as his hands began to shake too much to cook, as his sharp mind grew foggy. All while positioning himself as a concerned friend, offering to help manage the business during Julian's illness. After Julian's death, Warren moved quickly. He used forged documents to claim ownership of the property, destroyed evidence of his manipulation, and transformed the space into his vision of luxury dining. The community's protests were silenced through legal threats and economic pressure. Those who knew too much found themselves faced with accidents or sudden opportunities to leave town. The toy watch became his trophy, a reminder of his ultimate victory. Keeping it was risky, but Warren's arrogance demanded a souvenir. When he finally decided to dispose of it, leaving it with an abandoned baby seemed like poetic justice, another unwanted thing discarded in his wake. His new restaurant, Warren's, became the crown jewel of Boston's fine dining scene. Food critics praised his innovative menu, unaware that the signature dishes were Julian's creations. Society's elite flocked to his tables, drawn by the exclusivity and ignorant of the blood price of their luxury. Warren cultivated a careful public image, the self-made success story. the generous philanthropist who occasionally allowed charitable events in his restaurant, but behind closed doors he ruled through fear. His staff knew better than to question his methods or mention Julian's name. Those who showed too much curiosity about the restaurant's history found themselves suddenly unemployed, their reputations mysteriously tarnished. As years passed, Warren's power only grew. He opened more restaurants, each more exclusive than the last. His political connections ensured that health inspections were merely formalities, that zoning laws bent to his will, that police investigations into suspicious accidents quickly disappeared. But Warren's greatest fear remained buried in his past. The truth about Julian's death, documented in moments of paranoid precaution, haunted his private moments. He kept a careful watch on Derek Thompson's investigation, using his influence to block every attempt to uncover the truth. The homeless child, Ruby, worried him too. She saw too much, remembered too much. Now, as his carefully constructed world began to unravel, Warren faced a choice: silence those who threatened his empire, or watch everything he'd built crumble under the weight of truth. The answer, for a man like Warren, was never in doubt. He would do whatever was necessary to protect his position, just as he had done with Julian. The night that changed everything began with a scream. Ruby, searching for food behind Warren's restaurant, discovered something far more precious than discarded scraps. In the shadows of an industrial dumpster, wrapped in yesterday's newspapers, lay a newborn baby, impossibly small and eerily quiet. "Hello? Is someone there?" A deep voice cut through the darkness. Ruby froze, instinctively pulling back into the shadows she knew so well, but the baby's whimper betrayed their presence, and footsteps approached. Through the dim light, she saw a tall figure, Derek Thompson, though she didn't know his name yet. Their eyes met across the space between them, and Ruby saw something she rarely encountered on the streets: genuine concern. Not pity, not disgust, but real human concern. Derek moved slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I heard a scream. Are you all right?" Ruby pointed wordlessly at the dumpster, and Derek's gaze followed. His sharp intake of breath echoed in the alley as he saw the baby. Without hesitation, he reached in, gently lifting the tiny bundle. The newspaper fell away, revealing something that made Derek stumble backward: a toy watch, worn and dirty, secured around the baby's wrist. "This is impossible," Derek whispered, his voice thick with emotion. His fingers traced the watch's scratched face, and Ruby saw tears forming in his eyes. "This was my brother's, Julian's watch." The name sent a shiver through Ruby. Julian, the name she'd heard whispered in Warren's restaurant, always with an undercurrent of guilt or fear. She stepped forward, drawn by the raw pain in Derek's voice. I've heard that name before. In there," she pointed to the restaurant's back door. Derek's head snapped up, his attention suddenly laser-focused. "You've heard about Julian?" In Warren's restaurant, his voice carried an urgency that made Ruby want to both run away and tell him everything she knew. "Sometimes late at night I hear them talk," she admitted. "Warren. He mentions Julian sometimes, never when others are around, but he sounds angry, scared maybe." Derek knelt down, cradling the baby while keeping his eyes on Ruby. "What's your name?" he asked softly. When she hesitated, he added, "I'm not here to hurt you. I think maybe you can help me understand what happened to my brother." "Ruby," she whispered, then gestured to the baby. "Is it alive?" Derek nodded, checking the infant's pulse again. "Yes, but barely. We need to get help," he stood, decision made. "Come with us, Ruby, please. I think you know pieces of a puzzle I've been trying to solve for years." Ruby looked at the restaurant's back door, then at the baby with Julian's watch. Something clicked in her mind, a memory of Warren, late one night, muttering about getting rid of the last piece. She shuddered, understanding now what he might have meant. "The watch," she said suddenly. "Warren had it. I saw him with it last week in his office. He was angry, saying something about it being time to let the past die with the trash. The words had seemed strange then, but now they carried a horrifying weight. Derek's face hardened. "He did this," he said. "Not a question, but a certainty. He left this baby here to die with Julian's watch, a final insult to my brother's memory." The baby stirred, letting out a weak cry. Derek wrapped his coat around the tiny form, then looked at Ruby with determination. "I'm taking this child to the hospital, but I need your help, Ruby. You've seen things, heard things. Will you help me find out what really happened to Julian?" Ruby looked back at the dumpster, thinking of all the nights she'd spent searching for food, listening to fragments of conversations, piecing together a story she didn't understand. Now, suddenly she had a chance to make it mean something. "Yes," she said, standing straighter. "I'll help you, but Warren is dangerous. If he finds out, I'll protect you," Derek promised. "Both of you," he looked down at the baby, then back at Ruby. "It's time for the truth to come out. Julian deserved better than this. You both do." After ensuring the baby's safety at the hospital, Derek threw himself into investigating Warren's history with renewed determination. His home office became a war room, walls covered with photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings spanning 20 years. Ruby sat cross-legged on the floor, helping him organize the pieces of Julian's final months. "Look at this," Derek said, spreading out old building permits. Warren's original restaurant was failing. Health code violations, tax problems, everything. Then suddenly, right after Julian died, he had enough money to renovate completely. He traced the timeline with his finger. Where did that money come from? Ruby examined photographs of the restaurant's transformation. "The layout," she said suddenly. "It's exactly like the drawings I found in the storage room." The ones with Julian's name on them. She pulled out her worn notebook, filled with overheard conversations and observations. Warren didn't create this place. He stole Julian's design. Derek's investigation led them to former employees of Warren's original restaurant. Most refused to talk, fear evident in their eyes, but one elderly chef, terminally ill and past caring about consequences, shared a chilling account. Warren would invite Julian for coffee every morning, the old chef recalled, his hands trembling. Always insisted on preparing it himself. After a few months, Julian started getting sick. His hands would shake, he'd forget things. Warren watched it happen with this smile. The chef's voice broke. "I should have said something then. God forgive me, I should have stopped it." Bank records revealed a pattern of suspicious transfers. Warren had systematically drained Julian's accounts in the weeks before his death, using forged signatures and backdated documents. The money trail led to offshore accounts, then circled back to fund the restaurant's renovation. Most disturbing were the medical records Derek obtained through a sympathetic nurse. Julian's symptoms matched chronic arsenic poisoning, tasteless, gradual, nearly impossible to detect without specific testing. Warren had literally been killing him one cup of coffee at a time. "Why didn't Julian suspect?" Ruby asked one night, sorting through old photographs. "He seemed so smart in these pictures." Derek picked up a photo of Julian at a community dinner, because he always saw the best in people. Even when Warren started taking over the business, Julian thought he was just being helpful. His voice cracked. That's what Warren counted on, Julian's trust. Their investigation revealed a darker pattern in Warren's past. Other competing restaurants had mysteriously failed. Owners suffered accidents or suddenly left town. Health inspectors who cited violations were transferred or resigned. Warren hadn't just built a restaurant, he'd constructed a web of corruption and fear. Ruby proved invaluable, her years of invisible observation providing crucial details. She remembered conversations, meetings, faces that appeared in the restaurant's back alley. Her notebook contained dates and times that matched perfectly with suspicious incidents in Derek's timeline. One entry particularly caught Derek's attention. Warren angry about watch. Threw papers in furnace. said should have buried it with him. The date was just 1 week before they found the baby. The watch was evidence, Derek realized. Julian must have discovered something, documented it. Warren kept the watch as a trophy, but something made him panic, made him want to dispose of it. They discovered that Julian had been working on a detailed expose of corruption in the restaurant industry. His computer and notebooks vanished after his death, but Derek found backup files hidden in Julian's old email account. The documents outlined a network of bribes, health code violations, and labor exploitation centered around Warren's operations. He was going to expose everything, Derek said, reading through Julian's notes. Not just the restaurant, but the whole corrupt system that allowed Warren to operate. Ruby, who had been examining old photographs, suddenly gasped. She held up a picture of Julian at a community event. In the background, barely visible, was a woman Ruby recognized, her mother, years younger, wearing a waitress uniform. "I remember her working at a restaurant," Ruby whispered. Before she disappeared, she used to talk about a kind chef who helped everyone. Her hands trembled. It was Julian, wasn't it? That's why Warren hates me being around. I remind him of that time. Derek stared at the photograph, pieces clicking into place. Warren hadn't just killed Julian, he'd destroyed an entire community that had grown around Julian's vision. The abandoned baby, Ruby's presence, even the watch. They weren't random events. They were threads in a tapestry of vengeance and guilt that Warren had woven over decades. Late one night in Derek's study, Ruby sat staring at the photograph of her mother with Julian. The weight of the decision before her felt overwhelming. Warren had made it clear what happened to people who threatened his empire. They disappeared, just like her mother. "I can't guarantee your safety," Derek said softly, watching her internal struggle. "What we're doing, it's dangerous. Warren has powerful friends. No one would blame you for walking away." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You've already helped more than I could have hoped." Ruby traced her mother's face in the photograph. "She used to sing while she cooked," she whispered. "I remember that. She'd tell me stories about this wonderful chef who believed food could change lives." Her voice caught. "Warren didn't just kill Julian, did he? He killed that whole dream. He killed my mother's hope." The hospital had called earlier. The abandoned baby was recovering, growing stronger each day. Ruby had visited twice, watching the tiny figure fight for life with a determination that sparked something in her own heart. The toy watch remained in evidence, but its message was clear: some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. "I know what he's capable of," Ruby continued, opening her notebook. "I've watched him destroy people for years. The homeless woman who used to sleep behind the restaurant, she disappeared after seeing something through the kitchen window. The delivery boy who asked too many questions about old receipts, his family suddenly moved away." Derek nodded grimly. "We could take what we have to the police now. It might not be enough to convict him, but it would start an investigation." "No," Ruby said, her voice stronger. "If we do that, he'll destroy the evidence before they can act. We need something he can't deny, something recorded, something that proves everything." She stood up, decision made. "I can get that. He doesn't see me, not really. I'm just another street kid to him." "Ruby," "No," Derek protested. "It's too dangerous. If he catches you." "He won't," she insisted. "I've survived on the streets for years because I know how to be invisible. And now." She picked up the photograph again. "Now I have something worth fighting for. Julian tried to expose the truth, and Warren killed him for it. My mother knew something, and she disappeared. That baby was left to die with Julian's watch. It has to stop." Derek studied her face, seeing not a homeless child, but a warrior ready for battle. "What's your plan?" Ruby explained her idea, using Warren's own arrogance against him. She would play the desperate street urchin, willing to do anything for food. Warren's ego would love that, having someone so completely under his power. She would work her way into the restaurant, gathering evidence, recording conversations. "He talks more freely at night," she explained. When he thinks no one's listening, that's when the truth comes out. She patted the small recorder Derek had given her. One confession. That's all we need. Derek paced the room, conflicted. The idea of putting Ruby in danger went against every protective instinct he had developed since finding her. Yet he recognized the steel in her eyes, the same determination Julian had shown when standing up for what he believed in. If anything feels wrong, he insisted, anything at all, you get out immediately. I'll be nearby every night, ready to help. He pulled out a business card with his cell number. Memorize this. If you need me, I'll come running. Ruby took the card, committing the number to memory before burning it in the study's fireplace. We can't let him win, she said, watching the flames consume the evidence. Julian believed in something bigger than fancy dinners and expensive wine. He believed in people and giving everyone a chance at dignity. She turned to Derek, her face set with purpose. Your brother tried to build something beautiful. Warren destroyed that dream, but he couldn't destroy what it stood for. The baby surviving, US finding that watch, even me being here. It's like Julian is still fighting through us. Derek pulled her into a sudden hug, surprising them both. You're just as brave as he was, he whispered. Maybe braver. Ruby hugged him back, finally understanding what it felt like to have someone care about her safety, her future. We'll finish what Julian started, she promised. Together. The breakthrough came in the most unexpected way. While cleaning the restaurant's storage basement after hours, Ruby discovered a hidden panel behind an old wine rack. Her small hands traced the edges until she found a loose corner, revealing a space that contained a dusty box of documents. Inside, she found Julian's personal diary, its pages filled with increasingly shaky handwriting. The entries chronicled his declining health, starting shortly after Warren began their morning coffee ritual. Something's wrong, one entry read. My hands won't stop shaking. Warren says it's stress, but I've been saving coffee samples. Something isn't right. Ruby photographed each page with trembling fingers, her heart racing every time the old floorboards creaked above. The final entries were almost illegible, Julian's once precise handwriting deteriorating into desperate scrawls. The last dated entry chilled her to the bone. Warren's coffee. Test results tomorrow. If I'm right about the arsenic. The entry ended abruptly. Julian died the next day. Hidden among the diary pages, Ruby found medical receipts for toxicology tests and a sealed envelope addressed to Derek. Inside was a letter, never delivered, detailing Julian's suspicions and evidence. He'd been systematically collecting samples of Warren's special blend coffee, storing them in a secret location. Derek, Ruby whispered into her phone, hiding in the dark basement. I found something. Julian knew. He was gathering proof before her voice caught as footsteps sounded overhead. That night, they followed Julian's coded instructions to a small storage unit across town. Inside, preserved in sealed containers, were dozens of coffee samples. Each was dated, matching entries in Julian's diary about his symptoms. A final container held a note, if you're reading this, Warren succeeded. Test these. The truth is in the coffee. Derek arranged for private testing through a lab in another state, away from Warren's influence. The results confirmed their worst fears, increasing levels of arsenic in each sample, carefully administered to mimic a natural decline in health. He made it look like a wasting disease, Derek said, reviewing the lab reports. Doctors were so focused on Julian's symptoms, they never suspected poison. Warren watched him die slowly, pretending to be a concerned friend. But the evidence revealed something even more sinister. Among Julian's papers was a list of other suspicious deaths in the restaurant industry, competitors and critics who had mysteriously fallen ill over the years. Warren's pattern of elimination stretched back decades. Ruby found additional proof in the restaurant's old account books, hidden behind the same panel. Warren had been embezzling money from Julian's accounts while he was sick, using Julian's forged signature. The funds were traced to offshore accounts and then back to Warren's restaurant renovation. He didn't just kill Julian, Derek realized, spreading the documents across his study floor. He stole everything: the money, the restaurant plans, even Julian's original recipes. He built his success on my brother's grave. The most damning evidence came from Julian's final days. He had recorded conversations with Warren, capturing subtle threats and veiled admissions. In one recording, Warren spoke about removing obstacles and how some people need help leaving the business. Julian's voice, already weak, challenged him like the others. Warren, the ones who disappeared. Ruby discovered that her mother had worked as a waitress during that time, witnessing Warren's suspicious activities. Her disappearance coincided with Julian's death, another loose end Warren had tied up. "My mom," Ruby said, holding a staff photo from that era. "She knew too much. That's why she vanished. That's why I ended up on the streets." Tears rolled down her face as years of questions finally found answers. Derek held her as she cried, his own grief mixing with rage at Warren's cruelty. "We have him," he said firmly. "This time he can't escape justice." Julian made sure of that. The final piece fell into place when Ruby connected the abandoned baby to Warren's attempt to dispose of Julian's watch. "He kept it as a trophy," she explained. "But when we started investigating, he panicked. Leaving it with an abandoned baby was his way of disposing of evidence while making a final mockery of Julian's compassion." They gathered the evidence: the diary, test results, financial records, and recordings, creating multiple copies stored in secure locations. Julian had died building this case, and they wouldn't let his final effort be in vain. The atmosphere in Warren's restaurant changed subtly after their discovery. Ruby felt his eyes following her as she cleaned, noticed how conversations stopped when she entered a room. The pretense of benevolent employer dropped away, replaced by something predatory and calculating. One evening, as Ruby was leaving through the back door, Warren stepped out of the shadows. "You've been quite curious lately," he said softly, his voice carrying a deadly undertone. "Spending time in the basement, looking through old files. Why is that, I wonder?" He moved closer, backing her against the wall. "What exactly are you looking for?" Ruby's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Just cleaning, Mr. Warren." Like you asked, she clutched her bag tighter, feeling the weight of Julian's diary inside. Warren's hand shot out, gripping her arm with bruising force. "Let's be clear," he hissed. "I own this place, everything and everyone in it. Street rats like you should know their place." His fingers dug deeper. "Accidents happen to people who forget that." Later that night, Derek found Ruby trembling in his study. As she described Warren's threat, his face darkened with fury. "He won't touch you," Derek promised. "We'll get you somewhere safe." But Warren's reach extended further than they imagined. The next morning, Derek's car brakes failed on his way to work. A random mugging attempt left him with cracked ribs. Anonymous calls filled his voicemail with detailed descriptions of his daily routine, a clear message that he was being watched. The threats escalated. Ruby returned to her hidden sleeping spot behind the restaurant to find all her possessions destroyed. A note pinned to her tattered backpack read, "Children who play with fire get burned." That same night, a small fire broke out in Derek's garage, destroying boxes of Julian's old papers. Warren cornered Derek at a local coffee shop, sliding into the seat across from him with casual menace. "Your brother never learned," he said, stirring his coffee with deliberate slowness. "Some dreams are too big for little people. He died understanding that. Are you smarter than he was?" Derek met his gaze steadily. "Is that a threat, Warren?" Warren smiled, cold and empty. "A reminder. You have a nice life, Derek. Good job, comfortable home. It would be a shame to lose it all chasing ghosts." He leaned forward. "And that street girl you've taken in, such a dangerous life, being homeless. Anything could happen." The implied threat against Ruby made Derek's blood boil, but he maintained his composure. "You seem nervous, Warren. What are you afraid we'll find?" A flash of anger crossed Warren's face before his mask of civility returned. Find? There's nothing to find. Just like there was nothing to find 10 years ago. History has a way of repeating itself, Derek. Don't make me prove that. The pressure mounted from all sides. Health inspectors suddenly appeared at Derek's workplace, citing violations that threatened his license. Ruby was followed by strange men whenever she left the restaurant. Anonymous tips to child services suggested Derek was exploiting a homeless minor. One morning they found a dead rat on Derek's doorstep, wearing a tiny toy watch around its neck. The message was clear. Warren knew about their investigation and was done playing nice. "He's scared," Ruby observed, watching Derek document the grotesque warning. "All these threats, he wouldn't bother if we weren't close to something." Derek nodded grimly, but scared makes him dangerous. Julian probably saw this side of him too, right before he couldn't finish the sentence. That evening, Warren called a staff meeting at the restaurant. His eyes locked onto Ruby as he discussed recent security concerns and the need to protect the restaurant's reputation. "Loyalty is everything in this business," he announced. "Those who lack it tend to disappear." The threat hung in the air like poison. Ruby felt the other staff members withdraw from her, fear making them complicit in Warren's intimidation. She stood alone in a room full of people, understanding for the first time how completely Warren controlled his world through fear. When Derek and Ruby first attempted to share their evidence with the community, they met a wall of denial and disbelief. Warren's influence ran deeper than they had imagined, his carefully cultivated image of philanthropic businessmen shielding him from suspicion. At a community council meeting, Derek presented Julian's diary and the evidence of poisoning. The council members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes. "These are serious allegations," the chairman said, "against a respected member of our community. Where was this evidence 10 years ago?" "Warren's done so much for this neighborhood," another member added. "The fundraisers, the charity dinners. Why would he need to kill anyone?" The room murmured in agreement. Years of Warren's calculated generosity paying off in unwavering loyalty. Local business owners, who benefited from their association with Warren's prestigious restaurant, turned their backs. Shop windows that once welcomed Ruby now displayed no loitering signs. Derek's regular customers began canceling appointments, citing vague concerns about his stability. The local newspaper refused to investigate, the editor nervously explaining that they couldn't risk a lawsuit. Besides, he added, glancing at the advertisements for Warren's restaurant that filled his pages, "Some stories are better left alone." Even those who had known Julian hesitated to speak out. "Maybe we remembered him wrong," a former employee suggested. He was sick a lot near the end. Confused. Warren took care of everything. The rewriting of history happened before their eyes, Julian's memory being erased and replaced. The homeless community Ruby had grown up with withdrew, warned off by Warren's enforcers. Her old sleeping spots were suddenly occupied, familiar faces turned away when she approached. The message was clear: there would be consequences for supporting her claims. The hardest rejection came from Mrs. Peterson, Julian's former neighbor who had been like a grandmother to him. "Dear," she said to Derek, patting his hand, "I know you miss your brother. We all do. But these accusations, they're not what Julian would have wanted. He valued peace, community. This campaign against Warren, it's destroying everything Julian loved." Ruby watched the community's rejection eat away at Derek's resolve. "They're afraid," she told him one night, as they sat in his study surrounded by evidence no one wanted to see. "Warren doesn't just own the restaurant, he owns their fear." The final blow came during a neighborhood association meeting. Warren attended, playing the role of concerned citizen perfectly. He spoke movingly about Julian, describing him as a dear friend whose death still haunted him. Then, with practiced sadness, he addressed the accusations. "I understand grief," he said, his voice heavy with fake emotion. "When we lose someone, we look for reasons for someone to blame. My heart breaks for Derek, for this young girl he's drawn into his obsession. But this has to stop. For the community's sake, for Julian's memory. The association voted unanimously to distance itself from Derek's unfounded allegations. People he'd known for years crossed the street to avoid him. Donations to his legal fund were returned. Doors closed, phones went unanswered. Ruby found Derek in his study that night, staring at Julian's photograph. "Maybe they're right," he whispered. "Maybe I'm seeing things that aren't there. Julian's gone. Nothing will bring him back." But Ruby wasn't ready to give up. She pulled out her notebook, filled with years of overheard conversations and observed secrets. "Look," she said, pointing to specific entries. "These people who turned against us? Warren has something on each of them. Mrs. Peterson's grandson's college fund. Warren's scholarship, the newspaper editor's gambling debts, mysteriously paid off." She spread out the photos of Julian's community dinners, showing the same faces that now shunned them. "They remember. They're just too scared to admit it. But we have something Warren doesn't." "What's that?" Derek asked, his voice tired. "The truth," Ruby said firmly. "And Julian's real legacy, not the fancy restaurant or the charity events, the belief that everyone deserves dignity. That food can bring people together, break down walls." Then she grabbed his hand. "Warren can buy their silence, but he can't buy their hearts. They'll remember when we prove Julian was right." Derek squeezed her hand, feeling his determination return. The community's rejection hurt, but it also confirmed what they were fighting against: the power of fear to silence truth, to make good people complicit in evil. Julian had died fighting that power. They would honor his memory by continuing the fight. The basement of Warren's restaurant felt different at night, the shadows longer, the silence heavier with secrets. Ruby moved silently through the darkness, her small recorder ready to capture any evidence that might bring justice for Julian. She had chosen this night carefully. Warren was hosting a private meeting in his office, the kind where guards were posted at the doors and staff were sent home early. Hidden behind wine racks, Ruby could hear voices drifting down through the old ventilation system. Warren's voice carried clearly, growing louder as alcohol loosened tongues and lowered guards. "Remember when that fool Julian thought he could change things?" Warren laughed, the sound bitter and cold. "Some people need to learn their place in the natural order." Ruby's hands trembled as she adjusted the recorder, making sure to capture every word. The conversation above turned to business names of officials bought, health inspectors bribed, competitors threatened. Warren spoke freely, secure in his power, never suspecting that a small girl in the darkness below was documenting his confessions. Suddenly, footsteps on the stairs made Ruby freeze. The chef was coming down for more wine, his shoes clicking against the wooden steps. Ruby pressed herself into a narrow space between shelves, hardly daring to breathe. The chef passed within inches of her hiding spot, muttering to himself about Warren's dangerous mood. As he selected bottles, Ruby caught fragments of his whispered monologue. "Should have helped Julian, shouldn't have let Warren. The coffee, I knew about the coffee." Each word confirmed their suspicions, but Ruby needed more concrete evidence. The chef left, but Ruby stayed motionless, counting to 100 before daring to move again. She had discovered that the old ventilation system could carry her small frame to different parts of the building. Carefully, she climbed inside, crawling through dusty passages that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Above Warren's office, she found a loose vent cover that offered a perfect view of the room below. Warren sat at his desk, surrounded by men in expensive suits. On the desk lay folders, documentation of his crimes that Ruby knew they needed to copy. She watched as Warren pulled out Julian's old notebook, the one they had been searching for. "Last piece of evidence," he said, holding it up. "After tonight, nothing will be left to connect us to that unfortunate incident." He reached for his lighter. Ruby knew she had to act. Using techniques learned from years on the streets, she created a distraction, a carefully timed crash from another part of the building. As Warren and his guests rushed to investigate, she dropped silently into the office through the vent. Her hands shook as she photographed page after page of the notebook, along with documents spread across the desk. Bank statements showing bribes, letters threatening competitors, receipts for arsenic purchases. Warren had kept everything, his arrogance making him careless. The voices were returning. Ruby scrambled back into the vent, pulling the cover closed just as Warren re-entered. Her heart pounded so loud she feared they would hear it, but the men below resumed their meeting. "The Thompson boy is becoming a problem," one man said. "Like his brother doesn't know when to quit." Warren's response chilled Ruby to the bone. Everything has a solution. Julian's was in his morning coffee. Derek's will be equally effective. Ruby recorded it all, fighting back tears as Warren detailed his plans to eliminate Derek, just as he had Julian. The casual way they discussed murder made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to stay, to capture every damning word. Hours passed. Ruby's muscles cramped from staying still, but she didn't dare move until the meeting ended. As the last guest left, Warren made a final phone call to someone he called the cleaner he arranged for Derek to have an accident within the week. Only when the lights went out and Warren's car left the parking lot did Ruby emerge from her hiding place. Her whole body trembled with exhaustion and fear, but she had done it. In her pocket, the recorder held the truth about Julian's murder and Warren's criminal empire. She sent a text to Derek. "Got it. All of it. Get me out." Minutes later, Derek's car appeared in the back alley. Ruby ran to it, clutching her evidence close. As she reached for the door handle, a voice behind her made her blood freeze. Going somewhere, the chef stood in the doorway, his face unreadable in the darkness. Ruby prepared to run, but the chef raised his hands. "Wait," he said softly. "I should have helped Julian. I won't make the same mistake twice." He pressed a USB drive into her hand. "Security footage. Warren doesn't know I kept copies. Get justice for Julian." Ruby dove into Derek's car, her heart racing as they sped away. In her lap lay the proof they needed: recorded confessions, photographed documents, security footage, and the testimony of a guilty man finally choosing to do right. "We did it," she whispered, looking at Derek's determined profile. "We got him." Derek reached over and squeezed her hand. "Julian would be proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's finish this. For him." The weight of uncovering Warren's crimes took an unexpected toll on Derek. After Ruby's successful mission, he spent hours reviewing the evidence, listening to Warren's cold confessions about Julian's murder. Each recording, each document, brought fresh waves of guilt and self-loathing. "I should have known," he whispered one night, sitting in Julian's old room, untouched since his death. The coffee meetings, the sudden illness, Warren's convenient solutions, all the signs were there. "I was too blind, too caught up in my own life to see my brother dying in front of me." Ruby found him there, surrounded by Julian's old notebooks and photographs. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, his normally neat appearance disheveled. Empty coffee cups littered the desk. He'd stopped sleeping, haunted by nightmares of Julian's final days. "You can't blame yourself," Ruby said softly, picking up a photo of the Thompson brothers in happier times. Warren fooled everyone. He was careful, calculating. But Derek couldn't shake the memories. Each piece of evidence revealed another moment when he could have intervened, another chance he had missed to save his brother. The recorded conversations from Warren's office played in his mind on endless loop, the casual way they discussed Julian's murder, as if ending a life was no more significant than ordering dinner. "I was supposed to protect him," Derek's voice cracked. "I was the older brother. When our parents died, I promised to always look out for him. Instead, I let him walk into that snake pit alone." The depression deepened as they prepared their case against Warren. Derek withdrew from his work, his friends. His apartment, once meticulously organized, fell into disarray. Some days he could barely bring himself to get out of bed, the weight of his perceived failure crushing him. Ruby watched with growing concern as Derek spiraled. She found him one evening in his study, staring at an old bottle of sleeping pills. "I keep thinking," he said, not looking at her, "maybe if I had died instead of Julian, more people would have been saved. He was the one who wanted to help others. I just existed." The moment terrified Ruby. She snatched the pills away, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare," she said fiercely. "Julian didn't die so you could give up. He died fighting for something he believed in. Honor that by finishing what he started." Derek really looked at her for the first time in days. He saw the street-hardened child who had somehow become his reason to keep going, who carried Julian's spirit of compassion despite her harsh life. "When did you get so wise?" he asked, managing a weak smile. "When I found people worth fighting for," she replied, taking his hand. "Julian believed in second chances. This is yours, we can't bring him back, but we can make his death mean something." Still, the guilt lingered. Derek started seeing a therapist, trying to process 10 years of suppressed grief and responsibility. The sessions were brutal, forcing him to confront his feelings of inadequacy and failure. Julian chose his path, his therapist reminded him. He knew the risks of challenging someone like Warren. Your guilt doesn't honor his courage, it diminishes it. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While organizing Julian's papers, Derek found a letter his brother had written but never sent. In it, Julian expressed his pride in Derek, his gratitude for having a brother who supported his dreams, even when they seemed impossible. "You've always been my strength," Julian had written. "Even when you don't understand my choices, you stand by me. Whatever happens, know that you've been the best brother anyone could ask for." The letter broke something in Derek. He sobbed for hours, releasing years of pent-up grief and guilt. Ruby sat with him, her small hand in his, offering silent support as he finally began to heal. Gradually, Derek's focus shifted from self-blame to purpose. Julian's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a symptom of the corruption they were fighting. His brother had died trying to create something beautiful in a world Warren had made ugly. "We're not just seeking justice," Derek realized. "We're fighting for Julian's vision. A world where people help each other, where kindness isn't seen as weakness." The depression didn't vanish, but it became manageable. Derek learned to channel his guilt into determination, his grief into purpose. Each morning he looked at Julian's photograph and made a new promise: today, I'll live the way you taught me, with courage, with compassion, with hope. As Derek and Ruby built their case against Warren, witnesses began disappearing. The chef who had given Ruby the security footage was found in his apartment, an apparent suicide note beside him. But Ruby recognized Warren's methods, the same tactics he'd used to silence others who knew too much. "He didn't kill himself," Ruby insisted, showing Derek the chef's last text message to her, more evidence in safety deposit box. "Don't trust the Polly," the message ended abruptly. When they checked the safety deposit box, it had already been emptied. Warren moved systematically through anyone who might corroborate their story. Former employees received midnight visits from his security team, some recanted their statements, others left town without warning. A waiter who had witnessed Julian's decline was involved in a mysterious car accident, leaving him in a coma. The homeless community faced particularly brutal intimidation. People Ruby had known for years vanished from their usual spots. Those who remained wouldn't meet her eyes, fear having replaced any loyalty they once felt. "Tell your friend to drop it," one old man whispered to Ruby as she brought him food. "Warren's men, they're not just threatening us anymore." Tommy disappeared last week, found his cart in the river. His hands shook as he spoke. "Some fights aren't worth dying for." But Warren's most insidious tactics targeted potential allies in the business community. Restaurant owners who had known Julian found their establishments facing sudden health code violations. Suppliers who supported Derek's investigation lost contracts. Banks called in loans without warning. Mrs. Chen, who owned the small grocery store where Julian had bought ingredients for his community meals, stood firm despite the pressure. "Julian helped my family when no one else would," she told Derek. "I'm not afraid to tell the truth." The next day, her store burned down. The fire department called it faulty wiring, but Ruby found traces of accelerant the investigators had mysteriously overlooked. Mrs. Chen, her life's work destroyed, finally joined the ranks of the silenced. Warren's reach extended into law enforcement. Police officers who showed interest in the case were transferred or faced internal investigations. The detective initially assigned to review their evidence was found accepting bribes from one of Warren's shell companies. Even the media was not immune. A young journalist who started investigating Julian's death had her career destroyed by fabricated scandals. The local newspaper editor who had promised to help was photographed in compromising situations photos that mysteriously appeared on his desk the day before a planned expose. Ruby discovered Warren's methodology in documents hidden in his office. He kept detailed files on everyone who might threaten him, their weaknesses, their secrets, their pressure points. Each person had a price, whether it was money, fear, or protection of loved ones. "He doesn't just silence people," Ruby explained to Derek. "He makes them complicit. Once they give in once, they're part of his system. They can't speak up without exposing themselves." The pattern became clear. First came the offers: money, opportunities, solutions to problems. Those who refused faced escalating threats, usually targeting family members or livelihoods. The final stage, reserved for the truly stubborn, was permanent silence. Derek and Ruby worked desperately to protect their witnesses, but Warren's network was vast. Safe houses were compromised, anonymous testimonies traced back to their sources. Each loss of a witness felt like losing Julian all over again. One night, Ruby found a young homeless girl crying behind the restaurant. "Warren's men said they'd take my baby brother if I didn't tell them what you're doing," she sobbed. "I had to tell them, Ruby. I had to." The betrayals hurt, but Ruby understood. Warren had spent decades perfecting the art of breaking people's spirits. He didn't just threaten violence, he made people choose between their conscience and their survival. Yet each attempt to silence the truth somehow strengthened Derek and Ruby's resolve. They began documenting Warren's intimidation tactics, building a second case alongside the original murder investigation. His efforts to cover up the truth became evidence in themselves. Julian died because he stood alone against this, Derek said, reviewing their dwindling list of witnesses. "We won't make the same mistake. There has to be a way to protect people from Warren's reach." The final confrontation began on a rainy night when Warren's restaurant was closed for a private event. Ruby had positioned herself in the basement, recording device ready, while Derek waited in his car across the street. The plan was simple but dangerous: get Warren to confess while the recorder captured everything. Thunder rolled outside as Ruby heard Warren's voice above, slightly slurred from wine and false confidence. He was entertaining his inner circle, celebrating another successful intimidation campaign. Through the ventilation system, his words carried clearly to her hiding spot. To another year of success, Warren raised his glass. And to those who learned the hard way not to challenge us, laughter followed, the sound making Ruby's skin crawl. She adjusted the recorder, making sure to capture every word. "Remember Julian Thompson?" Warren continued, emboldened by alcohol and seeming victory. "Poor fool thought he could change the world with his community kitchen idea. As if this neighborhood needed more riffraff." He laughed again, darker this time. The arsenic in his coffee was almost a kindness. Ruby's hands trembled as she documented the confession, but she forced herself to stay silent. Warren was finally revealing everything they needed: the murder, the corruption, the years of intimidation. "His brother's becoming just as troublesome," one of the guests commented. "And that street rat he's protecting." Warren's voice turned cold. "Derek Thompson will have an unfortunate accident soon enough." As for the girl, he paused, and Ruby could hear the threat in his silence. "Children who play with fire tend to disappear." Suddenly, Derek's voice cut through the restaurant. Is that a confession? Warren, he stood in the doorway, recording device visible in his hand. Ruby's heart stopped. This wasn't part of the plan. Warren's reaction was instantaneous. "Get him," he shouted, but Derek stood his ground. "It's over," Derek said, his voice steady. "We have everything, the poisoning, the threats, the witnesses you silenced. Julian knew what you were doing. He documented everything." Warren's laugh was ugly. "And who's going to believe you? A grieving brother and a homeless brat. I own this town, Derek. Your brother learned that the hard way." The confrontation escalated quickly. Warren's men moved to surround Derek, but he didn't flinch. "You took everything from him," Derek continued. "His dreams, his reputation, his life. But you couldn't take his spirit. That lives on in every person you failed to break." Warren's composure cracked. "Your brother was weak," he shouted. "He thought he could change things, make a difference. I showed him the real-world power is all that matters." Ruby, hearing the confrontation above, knew she had to act. She had a second recording device, capturing Warren's rage-fueled confession. But as she moved to help Derek, she knocked over a wine bottle. The crash echoed through the basement. Warren's head snapped toward the sound. "Find whoever's down there," he ordered. "No witnesses." Footsteps thundered down the basement stairs as Ruby scrambled for hiding places. She could hear Derek upstairs, still confronting Warren, keeping him talking while the recording devices captured every damning word. "You poisoned him slowly," Derek's voice carried down. "Watched him suffer. Pretended to be his friend while you killed him." "He deserved it," Warren shouted, his control finally shattering. "All that talk about community, about helping people, he was destroying everything I built. The arsenic was too good for him. I wanted him to suffer, to see his precious dreams die before he did." Ruby, trapped between wine racks, watched Warren's men search the basement. She clutched the recorder to her chest, knowing it contained the evidence they needed. If she could just hold out a little longer. Above, the confrontation reached its climax. Warren, enraged beyond reason, pulled out a gun. "You want to join your brother, Derek? I can arrange that." Another tragic accident in the Thompson family. The sound of the gunshot seemed to freeze time itself. Ruby bit back a scream, tears streaming down her face. But then she heard Derek's voice again. "Strong and clear, is that another confession, Warren?" Police sirens pierced the night. Warren's face, visible through the basement grating, contorted with rage and disbelief as officers flooded the restaurant. His empire was crumbling, and he knew it. The police interview room fell silent as Ruby's recordings played. Warren's voice, captured in moments of unguarded arrogance, filled the space with undeniable evidence of his crimes. Detective Sarah Martinez leaned forward, her experienced eyes narrowing as each damning confession unfolded. Julian Thompson was a fool, Warren's recorded voice declared, thinking he could change things with his community kitchen nonsense. The arsenic in his coffee taught him the reality of business. The recording captured every detail, the methods of poisoning, the timeline, the calculated destruction of Julian's reputation. Ruby sat beside Derek, both watching as Warren's face turned ashen. The recording continued, revealing layers of corruption that had haunted the city for decades. Health inspectors bribed, competitors threatened, witnesses silenced. Warren's criminal empire exposed in his own words. The dosage was carefully planned, Warren's voice continued, the wine from that night having loosened his tongue. Small enough to mimic illness, large enough to ensure he'd never recover. Watching him deteriorate, still trusting me as his friend, that was the sweetest victory. Detective Martinez paused the recording. "How long did you gather this evidence?" she asked Ruby, her voice gentle but professional. "Months," Ruby replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "Warren never noticed me. To him, I was just another street kid, invisible." She pulled out her notebook, filled with dates, times, and overheard conversations. "I wrote everything down, even before I met Derek." The second recording device revealed Warren's confrontation with Derek, including the attempted shooting. "You want to know why I killed him?" Warren's enraged voice shouted. "Because he threatened everything I built. His community kitchen would have brought the wrong kind of people to my neighborhood. I couldn't let that happen." Warren's lawyer shifted uncomfortably as his client's confession played. Each attempt to dismiss the evidence as circumstantial fell apart as more recordings revealed the extent of Warren's crimes. Ruby's meticulous documentation proved crucial. She had recorded not just confessions, but conversations with Warren's associates, meetings with corrupt officials, and discussions of witness intimidation. The dates matched perfectly with Detective Martinez's cold case files on suspicious deaths and disappearances in the restaurant industry. "He kept talking about it," Ruby explained, pointing to specific entries in her notebook. "Late at night when he thought no one was listening, it was like he needed to brag about what he'd done to Julian. Every detail, every moment of suffering, he remembered it all." The recordings painted a picture of a man obsessed with power who saw Julian's compassion as a personal affront. Warren had kept trophies from his victim Julian's recipes, his business plans, even the toy watch that had led them to the truth. The watch was his favorite trophy, Ruby's notes revealed. He would take it out late at night, laugh about how Julian's dreams died with him. Leaving it with the abandoned baby was his way of mocking everything Julian stood for. Detective Martinez brought in forensic accountants who traced the money trail Ruby had documented. Warren's empire began unraveling offshore accounts, fake charities, bribes disguised as consulting fees. Each transaction supported the story told in Ruby's recordings. The most damning evidence came from Warren's own security cameras. Ruby had noted which cameras were real and which were fake, enabling the police to recover footage Warren thought had been deleted. The tapes showed him doctoring Julian's coffee, destroying evidence, and orchestrating the intimidation of witnesses. As the final recording played Warren's rage-filled confession during the confrontation, Ruby reached for Derek's hand. They watched Warren's face, seeing the moment he realized his carefully constructed world was crumbling. "I want to make a deal," Warren suddenly announced, breaking the room's tense silence. But Detective Martinez shook her head. "The evidence is overwhelming, Mr. Pierce. Miss Mitchell's recordings, combined with the forensic evidence and witness statements, leave no room for negotiation. Julian Thompson's murder will finally see justice." Ruby squeezed Derek's hand as Warren was led away in handcuffs. In her pocket, she carried one final recording, Julian's voice from an old security tape, talking about his dreams for the community kitchen. That one wasn't for the police or the trial. That one was for Derek, a brother's voice preserved, speaking of hope and change. The police operation to arrest Warren required careful planning. Detective Martinez knew they couldn't risk him destroying evidence or escaping justice as he had done for so many years. She coordinated with multiple departments, ensuring every exit was covered, every possible contingency planned for. The raid began precisely at midnight. Police vehicles silently surrounded Warren's restaurant, their lights off to maintain the element of surprise. SWAT teams took position at all exits, while forensics units waited nearby, ready to collect and preserve evidence. Inside the restaurant, Warren was still raging at Derek, unaware that his empire was about to crumble. The gun in his hand shook with anger as he continued his tirade, inadvertently confessing to more crimes with every word. Ruby remained hidden in the basement, her recorder capturing everything. Breach the command crackled over police radios, and officers stormed the restaurant from all directions. The heavy oak doors splintered under battering rams, and flash bangs disoriented Warren's security team. Detective Martinez led the main entry team, her voice clear and authoritative through the chaos. "Warren Pierce, you're under arrest for the murder of Julian Thompson and multiple counts of conspiracy," she announced, her weapon trained on Warren as other officers moved to secure him. Warren's reaction shifted from shock to rage to calculated calm in seconds. "This is a mistake," he said smoothly, lowering his gun. I'm a respected businessman. One phone call, and this all goes away. But this time was different. Detective Martinez produced a warrant listing charges backed by Ruby's recordings and Derek's evidence. Your phone calls won't work anymore, Mr. Pierce. We've already arrested the officials you bribed. Your network is finished. As officers handcuffed him, Warren's composure finally broke. Everything I built, he screamed. I killed that idealistic fool because he threatened everything I built. He deserved to die slowly, watching his dreams turn to ash. The confession echoed through the restaurant, captured by police body cameras and Ruby's recorder. Derek watched silently as the man who murdered his brother was led away, his years of grief and guilt finally finding resolution. Forensics teams swarmed the building, discovering hidden compartments filled with evidence Warren had arrogantly preserved. They found Julian's original documents, recipes stolen and claimed as Warren's own, and detailed records of the poisoning schedule that had killed him. Ruby emerged from the basement, clutching her recorder and notebook. Detective Martinez personally collected them, ensuring the chain of evidence remained unbroken. You're very brave, she told Ruby. Both of you are. Julian would be proud. The arrest made headlines. Restaurant mogul arrested for decade-old murder. Former employees came forward, their fear of Warren finally overcome by the sight of him in handcuffs. The community that had shunned Derek began to remember Julian's kindness, their silence broken by Warren's fall. As police led Warren to the waiting patrol car, he turned to Derek one last time. He was weak, Warren spat. All his talk about community and helping others, that's not how the world works. I showed him the real way of things. Derek stepped forward, his voice steady. No, Warren. Julian was stronger than you'll ever understand. His dream of bringing people together, of using food to build community, that's what terrified you. Because you could buy property and influence, but you couldn't buy what Julian had: people's love and trust. The evidence recovered from the restaurant revealed the full scope of Warren's crimes. Files detailed decades of corruption, blackmail, and violence. The officers discovered records of other murders, carefully disguised as accidents or illnesses, each victim a threat to Warren's power. Detective Martinez organized support for Warren's victims and witnesses, ensuring their protection as the case moved forward. The homeless community Ruby had grown up with began receiving help, their stories of Warren's intimidation finally heard and believed. Ruby watched as police carried box after box of evidence from the restaurant. It's really over, she whispered to Derek. Julian can rest now. Derek pulled her into a hug, both of them exhausted but relieved. Through the restaurant's windows they could see the sun beginning to rise, marking the end of Warren's reign of terror and the beginning of justice for Julian. The trial of Warren Pierce revealed a darkness that had poisoned the city for decades. As prosecutors presented their case, the courtroom fell silent, stunned by the scope of his crimes. Julian's murder was just the tip of a criminal empire built on intimidation, corruption, and murder. Evidence showed that Warren had eliminated at least 7 other restaurant owners over 20 years, each death carefully orchestrated to appear natural or accidental. Like Julian, they had threatened his dominance of the local restaurant scene. Each victim had received the same treatment: gradual poisoning, character assassination, and finally, death disguised as illness or accident. Ruby's mother's disappearance was finally explained. Sarah Mitchell had been a waitress who witnessed Warren tampering with Julian's coffee. Her disappearance was revealed to be murder, her body buried beneath Warren's first restaurant. The discovery left Ruby sobbing in Derek's arms, years of uncertainty finally replaced by devastating truth. The financial crimes were staggering. Warren had embezzled millions from Julian's accounts while he was dying, using the money to expand his restaurant empire. He had maintained a network of corrupt health inspectors, police officers, and city officials, all paid to look the other way or actively participate in his schemes. Most shocking was the revelation about the abandoned baby with Julian's watch. DNA testing revealed the infant to be the child of one of Warren's victims, a young chef who had discovered evidence of his crimes. Warren had murdered the parents and left their baby to die, a final act of cruelty made worse by his use of Julian's watch as a twisted message. The prosecutor's voice shook with controlled anger as she presented Ruby's recordings. Warren's casual discussions of murder, his laughter while describing Julian's suffering, his threats against Derek and Ruby, the evidence painted a picture of a man devoid of conscience. Former employees testified about years of abuse and coercion. They described watching Julian's slow decline, powerless to help as Warren isolated and poisoned him. Many broke down on the stand, the guilt of their silence finally overwhelming them. Detective Martinez presented the forensic evidence: soil samples from Ruby's mother's grave matching Warren's old restaurant, arsenic traces preserved in Julian's exhumed remains, DNA evidence linking Warren to multiple crime scenes. The scientific proof supported every word of Ruby's recordings. The community leaders who had shunned Derek now faced their own complicity. Warren's records revealed how he had manipulated them through bribes, blackmail, and threats. Their testimony showed how one man's evil had corrupted an entire neighborhood's moral compass. Warren sat emotionless throughout the proceedings, showing no remorse as his victims' families testified about lives destroyed. Only when Ruby took the stand did his mask slip, revealing the rage that had driven him to murder Julian and destroy so many others. "He killed my mother," Ruby testified, her voice steady despite her tears. "He killed Julian. He tried to kill that baby." All because they saw the truth about who he really was. Her testimony, combined with her detailed documentation of Warren's crimes, left no doubt about his guilt. The evidence painted a picture of a man who saw kindness as weakness, community as a threat. Warren had built his empire by destroying anyone who challenged his vision of power and exclusivity. Julian's dream of a restaurant that welcomed everyone, that built community through food, had represented everything Warren despised. The revelation of Warren's crimes sent shockwaves through the community, forcing everyone to confront their roles in his decades of terror. Local business owners gathered at the courthouse steps, holding candlelight vigils for Julian and the other victims. Many wept openly, haunted by memories of times they'd chosen silence over justice. Mrs. Peterson, Julian's elderly neighbor who had initially doubted Derek's claims, became an unexpected voice for change. "We failed Julian," she declared at a community meeting. "We let fear silence us. Every time we looked away, every time we chose safety over truth, we helped Warren destroy another life." The homeless community Ruby had grown up with began emerging from the shadows. With Warren's network of intimidation dismantled, they shared stories of years of abuse and exploitation. The true extent of his cruelty became clear as they described how he had used them as disposable pawns in his schemes. Former restaurant employees formed a support group dealing with their collective trauma and guilt. The chef, who had given Ruby the security footage, though deceased, was posthumously honored for his final act of courage. His family received support from a victims fund established by the district attorney's office. The baby found with Julian's watch, now thriving in foster care, became a symbol of both Warren's cruelty and the community's redemption. Local families competed to adopt him, each wanting to provide the love and security Warren had tried to deny him. Derek and Ruby visited regularly, determined that this child would know only kindness. Ruby's mother's death sparked a movement to protect vulnerable workers in the restaurant industry. The Sarah Mitchell Act was proposed, requiring enhanced security measures and whistleblower protections for restaurant employees. Her story became a rallying cry for workers' rights advocates. The corrupt officials exposed during Warren's trial faced their own reckonings. As they were arrested and charged, public trust had to be rebuilt from scratch. New oversight committees were formed, with community members like Derek serving as watchdogs against future corruption. Most profound was the change in how the community viewed itself. The wealthy patrons who had frequented Warren's restaurant now supported smaller, family-owned establishments. The barriers between social classes that Warren had reinforced began to crumble as people remembered Julian's vision of food bringing people together. Local restaurants started hosting community dinners, honoring Julian's memory by serving anyone who needed a meal. The very concept Warren had mocked, using food to build community, became the foundation for healing the neighborhood's deep wounds. For the first time, the homeless individuals Ruby had grown up with were treated as valued community members rather than nuisances. Their stories were heard, their needs addressed, and their dignity restored. The transformation Julian had dreamed of began happening, sparked by the exposure of Warren's crimes. But healing wasn't easy. Trust had been broken on so many levels that some wounds would take years to mend. The community had to learn how to support each other again, how to stand against injustice instead of turning away in fear. The attempt on Derek's life came during the final days of Warren's trial. Despite being in custody, Warren's influence still reached beyond prison walls. As Derek left the courthouse after testifying, a black SUV swerved onto the sidewalk, aiming directly for him. Time seemed to slow as Derek saw the vehicle approaching. His mind flashed to Julian, wondering if this was how his brother felt in his final moments, seeing death approach but unable to stop it. Then Ruby's scream cut through his paralysis. She sprinted toward him, pushing him out of the vehicle's path. They tumbled together, the SUV missing them by inches before crashing into a newspaper stand. Derek's head struck the pavement hard, and darkness engulfed him. As consciousness faded, he heard Ruby calling his name, felt her small hands pressing against his bleeding head. In the space between life and death, Derek experienced something extraordinary. He found himself in Julian's old kitchen, the warm scent of fresh bread filling the air. Julian stood at the stove, looking exactly as he had before the poisoning began. "You did it," Big Brother Julian said, turning to face him. "You found the truth. You protected what I couldn't." His smile was gentle, free of the pain that had marked his final days. Derek tried to speak, to apologize for not saving him, but Julian shook his head. "No regrets," he said firmly. "You gave my death meaning. You and Ruby, you're carrying forward everything I believed in. That's worth more than revenge." The vision shifted, showing glimpses of the future Ruby graduating college, the abandoned baby growing into a strong young man, a new restaurant rising from the ashes of Warren's empire. Julian's voice echoed, "This is your legacy now. Live it for both of us." Derek awoke in the hospital 3 days later, Ruby asleep in a chair beside his bed. His head throbbed, but the guilt that had haunted him for 10 years had lifted. He understood now that honoring Julian's memory meant embracing life, not dwelling in grief. The police caught Warren's hitman, adding attempted murder to his growing list of charges. But Derek barely registered this news. His focus had shifted to the future. Julian had shown him the work still to be done, the lives still to be touched. "I saw him," he told Ruby when she woke. "Julian, he showed me what we need to do next." His voice was weak but filled with purpose. Ruby squeezed his hand, understanding in her eyes. She had kept vigilant watch during his unconsciousness, refusing to leave his side, just as he had refused to abandon her. Their bond, forged in tragedy and strengthened by shared purpose, had become unbreakable. The discovery came while Derek was still recovering in the hospital. Ruby, organizing his apartment, found a loose floorboard beneath Julian's old desk. Inside was a waterproof container filled with letters, each dated and sealed, along with a USB drive and a small leather notebook. "Dear Derek," the first letter began. "If you're reading this, then my suspicions about Warren were correct. I'm writing these letters to explain everything, to ensure the truth survives even if I don't." The handwriting was steady, written before the poisoning had begun to affect Julian's motor skills. Each letter detailed another aspect of Warren's corruption. Julian had meticulously documented health code violations, worker exploitation, and suspicious accidents at competing restaurants. He'd gathered testimonies from homeless individuals who had witnessed Warren's late-night activities, including meetings with corrupt officials. The most shocking revelation came from the USB drive. Julian had installed hidden cameras in the restaurant's kitchen, capturing Warren tampering with his coffee. The footage showed Warren adding increasing amounts of arsenic, watching with cold satisfaction as Julian's health deteriorated. "I knew he was poisoning me," one letter explained, "but I had to gather enough evidence to stop him permanently. If I confronted him too soon, he would just destroy the evidence and start again with someone else. I had to think beyond my own survival." The leather notebook contained something even more precious: Julian's original recipes and business plans for his community kitchen. But these weren't just recipes, they were a blueprint for social change. Each dish came with notes about its cultural significance, its potential to bring people together, its role in building community. "Food is more than sustenance," Julian had written. "It's a universal language of love, of belonging." Warren sees food as a way to exclude people, to mark social status. "I see it as a way to break down those very barriers." Most poignant were Julian's final letters to Ruby's mother, Sarah Mitchell. He had discovered her connection to Ruby, but hadn't lived long enough to reunite them. "Sarah is documenting Warren's crimes," he wrote. "She's brave, like her daughter, but I fear for her safety. If anything happens to me, make sure Ruby knows her mother died protecting others." The last letter was dated the day before Julian's death. His handwriting was shaky, but his words remained clear and strong. "Derek, don't let guilt consume you. I chose this path knowing the risks. What matters isn't how I died, but what we stood for. The restaurant wasn't just about food, it was about dignity, community, hope. Those values can't be poisoned." Along with the letters was a sealed envelope containing adoption papers. Julian had been preparing to adopt Ruby, having discovered her connection to Sarah. He had recognized in her the same spirit of resilience and compassion that had driven his own mission. "She's special," Derek, the final letter read. "If anything happens to me, find her, protect her. She carries her mother's strength and her own unique light. Together you can build something even more beautiful than I imagined." Ruby read the letters with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding why she had felt such a deep connection to Julian's story. She wasn't just fighting for justice, she was completing a circle that had begun before she was born. Derek watched her from his hospital bed, seeing his brother's compassion living on in this brave young girl who had risked everything for truth. Julian's letters hadn't just provided evidence, they had given them a roadmap for healing, for transformation, for hope. The truth emerged from a DNA test ordered during the investigation of Sarah Mitchell's murder. The results arrived while Derek was still in the hospital, delivered personally by Detective Martinez. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. "Ruby," she said gently, "we compared your DNA with samples from both Sarah Mitchell and Julian Thompson." She paused, meeting Ruby's eyes. "The results show that Julian was your biological father." The revelation stunned both Ruby and Derek into silence. Ruby's memories suddenly shifted, taking on new meaning: her mother's stories about the kind chef, her inexplicable connection to Julian's case, even her inherited love of cooking. It all made sense now. Further investigation revealed the full story through Sarah's preserved diary. She and Julian had fallen in love while working at his first restaurant. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant, Warren had already begun his campaign of intimidation. Fearing for their child's safety, they had kept Ruby's paternity secret. "I remember him now," Ruby whispered, tears falling freely. "He used to come to our apartment late at night. Mum would let him hold me, and he'd tell stories about the restaurant he was going to build." The memories surfaced like bubbles in clear water, each one bringing both joy and pain. Julian's letters took on new significance. His determination to protect Ruby, his secret preparation of adoption papers, his final battle against Warren, it had all been for his daughter. Even in death, he had found a way to bring her back to her true family. Derek watched his niece. The word felt strange and wonderful as she processed the truth. She had Julian's eyes, his determination, his unwavering sense of justice. The family resemblance was suddenly obvious, written in every line of her face. He knew, Ruby said, reading through Julian's letters again. He was gathering evidence, not just to stop Warren, but to make sure I would be safe. He died protecting me. Her voice broke on the last words. Sarah's diary revealed that Warren had discovered the truth just before Julian's death. He had used this knowledge to force Sarah's silence, threatening Ruby's life if she exposed his crimes. When Sarah finally decided to come forward anyway, Warren had eliminated her, leaving Ruby alone on the streets. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew," Derek told Ruby, pulling her into a hug. "And now I understand why you're just as brave. It's in your blood." The discovery changed everything. Ruby wasn't just a witness or an ally in their fight for justice. She was Julian's legacy, living proof that love and courage could survive even the darkest circumstances. News of Ruby's identity strengthened the prosecution's case against Warren. The jury saw not just a murderer, but a man who had deliberately orphaned a child, who had tried to destroy an entire family. The revelation of Ruby's paternity transformed the trial from a criminal case into a story of family, loss, and ultimate redemption. Detective Martinez ensured that all legal documentation was updated to reflect Ruby's true identity. Ruby Mitchell became Ruby Mitchell Thompson, her father's name finally restored to her after so many years. The revelation of Ruby's identity sparked a profound change in the community. Those who had once shunned Derek and doubted Julian's innocence now rallied around his daughter. The neighborhood that Warren had tried to control through fear began healing through acts of collective support and remembrance. Local restaurants, once intimidated by Warren's influence, joined together to establish a culinary scholarship in Julian's name. The program would help underprivileged youth pursue careers in cooking, embodying Julian's belief that food could transform lives. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly neighbor who had initially doubted Derek, opened her home to Ruby, sharing stories of Julian's early days in the neighborhood. He would test his recipes, here she told Ruby, tears in her eyes. Always saying how food brought people together. Now I see that spirit in you. The homeless community Ruby had grown up with received support from an unexpected source. Business owners who had once called police to remove them now offered jobs, housing assistance, and dignity. Julian's vision of a community that cared for all its members began taking shape. Even Warren's former employees stepped forward, determined to make amends. They shared stories of Julian's kindness, how he would feed anyone who was hungry, regardless of their ability to pay. Their testimonies helped rebuild his reputation and restore his true legacy. The baby found with Julian's watch was adopted by a local family who had known Julian. They promised to raise him with stories of the man whose death had ultimately led to his rescue. Ruby visited often, forming a special bond with the child who, like her, had been saved by her father's legacy. Local officials, eager to distance themselves from Warren's corruption, established the Julian Thompson Community Development Fund. The initiative focused on supporting small businesses that demonstrated commitment to social responsibility and community engagement. Derek watched in amazement as the neighborhood transformed. Streets that had once emptied at nightfall now buzzed with community gatherings. The barriers between social classes that Warren had enforced began dissolving as people shared meals, stories, and support. Ruby found herself at the center of this transformation, not as a victim or a witness, but as living proof of Julian's values. Her story inspired others to confront their own complicity in Warren's regime and work toward redemption. "Your father believed in second chances," Derek told Ruby as they watched another community dinner unfold. "He would be proud to see how you've helped give this neighborhood a second chance." The weekly community dinners became a symbol of this redemption. People from all walks of life gathered to share food and fellowship exactly as Julian had envisioned. Ruby often cooked, using her father's recipes, keeping his dream alive through every meal served. The opening of Julian's Dreams took place exactly 1 year after Warren's conviction. The building, once a symbol of exclusivity and corruption under Warren's ownership, had been transformed into the welcoming space Julian had originally envisioned. The renovation was funded by the community, with local artists painting murals depicting scenes of unity and hope on walls that had once displayed expensive artwork. Ruby stood beside Derek at the entrance, both wearing chef's whites embroidered with Julian's original logo. The line of people waiting to enter stretched around the block, not wealthy socialites, but a true cross-section of the community Julian had wanted to serve. "Welcome to Julian's Dreams," Ruby announced, her voice clear and strong as she cut the ribbon. Where everyone has a place at the table, the crowd erupted in applause, many wiping away tears as they remembered the man whose vision had finally come to life. Inside, the restaurant bore little resemblance to Warren's austere establishment. Warm colors and comfortable seating replaced cold elegance. The menu featured Julian's original recipes, with prices set on a sliding scale to ensure accessibility for all. A wall of photographs told the story of Julian's life and legacy, including newly discovered pictures of him with Ruby as a baby. The kitchen operated on Julian's principles: apprenticeships for at-risk youth, cooking classes for the community, and a policy that no one would be turned away hungry. The staff included former homeless individuals Ruby had known from the streets, now trained and employed with dignity. Derek watched as Ruby worked in her father's kitchen, moving with the same grace and purpose he remembered in Julian. She had inherited not just his talent for cooking, but his ability to make every person who entered feel valued and welcome. The centerpiece of the restaurant was Julian's original toy watch, displayed in a case near the entrance. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Time reveals truth. Justice comes to those who wait." In memory of Julian Thompson, who gave his life fighting for a dream that could not be poisoned. The first meal served was Julian's signature dish, a simple but perfect bread that he had once said could feed body and soul alike. As the aroma filled the restaurant, Derek saw tears in Ruby's eyes, knowing she was remembering the father she had lost and found again through this place. "He's here," Ruby whispered, looking around at the vibrant, diverse crowd enjoying their meal together. This is exactly what he wanted: not just a restaurant, but a home for everyone who needs one. The evening ended with a community feast where everyone helped serve everyone else, breaking down the traditional barriers between staff and customers. It was the embodiment of Julian's philosophy that food was about more than sustenance. It was about building connections, creating family, and nourishing hope. 6 months after Julian's Dreams opened, the restaurant hosted a special gathering. Former employees from Julian's original venture, friends who had helped expose Warren's crimes, and even some of Warren's victims' families came together to share their stories and begin healing. The evening began with Derek and Ruby unveiling a previously undiscovered video of Julian, found in the old restaurant's security archives. In it, Julian spoke directly to camera, as if he knew someday his family would watch. "Food brings people together," he said, his eyes bright and alive. "When we share a meal, we share our humanity. That's what Warren never understood." Ruby, now officially Ruby Mitchell Thompson, stood at the front of the room and shared memories of her mother Sarah. Stories of late-night cooking sessions, whispered conversations about Julian, and dreams of a better future brought both tears and laughter from the assembled guests. The baby found with Julian's watch, now a toddler named Hope by his adoptive parents, played near the memorial wall. Ruby had become his godmother, ensuring that both children affected by Warren's cruelty would grow up surrounded by love and family. Detective Martinez attended with news that more of Warren's victims had been identified and their families notified. Each family received a special edition of Julian's cookbook, complete with his handwritten notes about the power of food to heal and unite. The most touching moment came when Mrs. Peterson presented Ruby with Julian's original chef's coat, carefully preserved all these years. "He would want his daughter to have this," she said, her voice trembling. "You're carrying his dream forward in ways he could only imagine." Derek watched his niece don the coat, seeing in her the perfect blend of Julian's compassion and Sarah's strength. The Thompson family legacy had not ended with Julian's death. It had transformed and grown stronger through Ruby. As they shared a meal prepared from Julian's recipes, stories flowed freely. Former rivals became friends, old wounds began to heal, and new connections formed. It was exactly the kind of evening Julian had always dreamed of creating. 5 years after the opening of Julian's dreams, the restaurant had become more than just a place to eat. It was a living testament to the triumph of love over hatred, of justice over corruption. The legacy Julian and Sarah had died protecting now flourished through their daughter Ruby and the community they had fought to build. The Julian Thompson Foundation, established with the proceeds from Warren's seized assets, provided scholarships for underprivileged youth interested in culinary arts. Each year, dozens of students learn not just cooking techniques, but the values Julian had lived and died for: community, compassion, and courage. Ruby, now a renowned chef in her own right, continued her father's tradition of using food to break down social barriers. Her cooking classes for homeless youth became a model program replicated in cities across the country. Many of her first students had gone on to open their own community-focused restaurants. Derek, watching his niece carry forward Julian's dream, finally found peace with his brother's death. The guilt that had haunted him for so long transformed into purpose as he mentored young entrepreneurs who shared Julian's vision of business as a force for social good. The neighborhood Warren had tried to control through fear became known instead for its inclusive community events, centered around the restaurant. Monthly Everyone's Table dinners brought together people from all walks of life, sharing food and stories in the spirit Julian had always envisioned. Hope, the baby found with Julian's watch, grew into a curious child who loved helping in the restaurant's kitchen. Though too young to remember the events that brought him there, he understood he was part of a larger story of love triumphing over darkness. The final chapter of Warren's story came with news of his death in prison, alone and forgotten. But Julian's story continued to grow and evolve through every life touched by his dream, every meal shared at his daughter's table, every act of kindness inspired by his sacrifice. As Ruby closed the restaurant one evening, she found Derek staring at Julian's picture on the memorial wall. "He won, didn't he?" she said softly. "Not just against Warren, but in showing us all a better way to live." Derek nodded, pulling his niece close. He believed love was stronger than fear, he replied. And look around, he was right. The legacy lived on in every meal served, every life changed, every barrier broken down. Julian's dream had not died with him, it had taken root and flourished in ways he could never have imagined, proving that some dreams are too powerful to be poisoned, some loves too strong to be destroyed. If this story of justice, love, and redemption has touched your heart, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What touched you most about Julian's legacy and Ruby's journey? Your perspective matters, and we'd love to hear from you. Support our team's dedication to crafting meaningful narratives by subscribing to our channel. Each subscription encourages us to continue sharing stories that illuminate the triumph of love over darkness. Help spread this message of hope by sharing this video with friends and family. Together we can inspire more people to believe in the power of justice and love. Don't forget to like this video to help others discover this touching story. Join our community of storytellers and dreamers. Your support makes these tales of courage possible.